I let people believe something about me that wasn't true. I thought it was easier to stay quiet than to explain the truth. But that lie slowly turned into a story everyone accepted. And one day, I realized I wasn't just misunderstood anymore. I was trapped in it. The misunderstanding started in a way that barely registered. It wasn't a lie I told, it was something I didn't correct. A detail small enough that stopping the conversation to clarify it would have felt awkward, maybe even unnecessary. At the time, it seemed easier to let it pass. I remember thinking I'd fix it later, when it mattered. I didn't realize that was the moment it began to matter. We were sitting around a table with people who knew me only loosely, friends of friends, the kind of group where everyone fills in the blanks about each other based on fragments. Someone mentioned an experience I had been adjacent to, not directly part of. The way it was phrased made it sound like I'd played a larger role than I had. I hesitated, just long enough. No one challenged it. Someone nodded. Another person asked a follow-up question that assumed the first version was correct. By the time I opened my mouth, the conversation had already moved forward, building on something I hadn't actually said yes to, but hadn't denied either. So I adjusted, not by inventing anything new, just by answering in a way that didn't contradict what they now believed. I stayed vague, non-committal. I told myself I was being polite, that correcting them would derail the moment and make things uncomfortable for everyone. It felt harmless, almost invisible. After that, the detail resurfaced occasionally, always slightly reshaped by whoever retold it. Each version drifted a bit further from the truth, but never enough to sound absurd. I noticed it, but I also noticed how people reacted to me when it came up, how their tone shifted, how their interest sharpened. They weren't impressed exactly, just more attentive, as if they'd placed me in a different category than before. Correcting it became harder each time, not because the truth was complicated, but because the untruth had become shared. It lived in conversations I hadn't been part of. It had been repeated in my absence, solidified by other people's voices. If I pushed back now, it wouldn't just be clarification, it would be contradiction. And contradiction invites questions. So I kept doing what I'd been doing, answering carefully, staying close enough to the truth that I could tell myself I wasn't lying, but far enough from it that the misunderstanding stayed intact. I convinced myself that everyone exaggerates their past a little, that memory is flexible, that this was just how stories evolved. Still, there were moments when it caught me off guard. Someone referenced it with certainty, citing details I didn't recognize. Someone else thanked me for something I hadn't done with a sincerity that made my stomach tighten. I laughed it off, nodded along, and felt the gap between what they believed and what I knew widen just a little more. I started rehearsing explanations in my head, if anyone ever asked directly, if someone pressed for specifics. I imagined the relief of finally correcting it, of clearing the air. I also imagined the confusion, the disappointment, the subtle recalibration that would follow, people reassessing me, conversations cooling, interest fading. I didn't like how clearly I could picture that outcome. What unsettled me wasn't the fear of being exposed. It was the realization that I was actively maintaining something false, not because it benefited me in any tangible way, but because undoing it felt like it would cost too much. The misunderstanding had stopped being external. It had become a choice, and the longer I lived with it, the more I started to wonder whether correcting the record would actually restore the truth or just create a different kind of damage I'd then be responsible for. I didn't notice the shift right away. Not because it wasn't there, but because it arrived disguised as familiarity. People began referencing the story more freely, with less hesitation, as if it were established fact. It came up in introductions, in side comments, in moments where it didn't quite belong. I heard my name paired with it by people I'd never discussed it with directly. That was when I understood it had moved beyond me. It had become social currency. The first time it asked something of me was subtle. Someone sought my opinion, not casually, but with expectation. They framed a situation as if I had authority, as if my perspective carried weight because of that past involvement everyone now assumed. I responded cautiously, steering the conversation toward generalities, but I could feel the disappointment when I didn't deliver what they were looking for. After that, it happened more often. Questions became more specific, requests more pointed. People weren't just listening anymore. They were measuring my answers against a version of me they believed they knew. I started choosing my words the way you choose your footing on unstable ground, aware that one wrong step could expose the gap underneath. I told myself I was managing it. Then came the night I couldn't. We were gathered in a familiar place, the kind where conversations overlap and no one is really paying attention, until suddenly they are. Someone brought up the story again, casually, and this time added a detail I had never even heard before. It was wrong. Not distorted, not exaggerated, just false. I felt it land in my chest before I could think. I opened my mouth to correct it instinctively. The words were right there. But before I could speak, someone else jumped in to reinforce it, referencing another moment, another supposed confirmation. Heads nodded. The group settled into it with an ease that made me feel strangely out of place. Correcting it now wouldn't just be awkward, it would be disruptive. I stayed quiet. That silence felt heavier than all the previous ones combined. It wasn't passive anymore, it was participation. I realized, with a kind of clarity that bordered on panic, that I was no longer just benefiting from the misunderstanding, I was protecting it. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched differently, not suspiciously, but expectantly, as if people were waiting for me to step fully into a role I'd been cast in without auditioning for it. I noticed how often conversations paused after I spoke, how quickly my words were taken up and repeated by others. I noticed how people deferred to me in situations I had no right to lead. Each time it happened, the distance between who I was and who they thought I was stretched thinner. I started losing track of which details I'd corrected internally and which I'd allowed to stand. The truth no longer felt like a fixed point. It felt like something I had to reconstruct every time I thought about it. That scared me more than the idea of being confronted. Because if someone asked me directly, plainly, what had really happened, I wasn't entirely sure how to answer without unraveling more than just the story. The moment that made it impossible to keep pretending came quietly. Someone approached me alone. No audience, no assumptions layered into the question, just a look that held too much certainty for comfort. They told me there was an opportunity coming up, one that depended entirely on my experience. They said my name had come up specifically, that people trusted me because of what I'd been through. They asked if I'd be willing to take the lead. I didn't answer right away, because saying yes would mean committing to a version of myself that didn't exist, and saying no would raise the exact questions I'd been avoiding from the beginning. I nodded instead, and as I did, I felt the last remaining space between the truth and the story finally close. The opportunity arrived faster than I expected. It wasn't framed as a challenge or even a responsibility. It was presented as trust, a natural extension of what people already believed about me. The kind of thing you're offered when a narrative has settled enough that no one thinks to question it anymore. I was given time to prepare, space to shape the approach, a quiet assumption that I knew what I was doing. I didn't. What I had was proximity, not experience, familiarity, not authority. Everything I'd accumulated was secondhand. Stories heard, moments observed, impressions mistaken for understanding. I could imitate the language well enough, mirror the confidence people expected, but underneath it there was nothing solid to stand on. The first cracks showed early. A question I couldn't answer without circling, a decision I delayed because choosing either option would reveal how little I actually knew. I watched faces as I spoke, searching for doubt. When I didn't see it, the relief felt wrong, unearned. Each step forward narrowed my options. Backing out would no longer just be honesty, it would be disruption. People had adjusted their expectations around me. Plans had been made. Saying I can't would force them to ask why they thought I could in the first place. So I kept going. Not recklessly, carefully. I leaned on others where I could, framed uncertainty as collaboration, let stronger voices fill the gaps I left open. On the surface, things held. Quietly, the role kept expanding. Until someone asked the wrong question. It was specific, technical, the kind that only has one real answer. I felt the pause stretch too long. I heard myself start to speak, then stop. In that brief silence, something shifted. No one reacted immediately, but the air changed. Later, someone pulled me aside. They didn't accuse me, they didn't sound angry. They just said they were confused. They asked how my experience fit with what they'd just seen. For the first time since this began, there was no audience to manage, no version of myself to perform. I told them the truth. Not all at once, not dramatically, just enough. I explained the original misunderstanding, how I hadn't corrected it, how it had grown, how I'd let it stand because undoing it felt worse than living with it. They listened without interrupting. When I finished, they nodded slowly, not in agreement, in recognition, as if the explanation confirmed something they'd already suspected but hadn't named. The conversation didn't end things immediately, but it changed them. Word spread, not as scandal, but as adjustment. Expectations recalibrated. The opportunity was reframed, then quietly handed to someone else. No announcement, no fallout, just a subtle retreat from the version of me that had existed a week earlier. Some people treated me the same, others became distant. A few avoided me entirely. I didn't try to explain myself further. The truth, once released, didn't belong to me anymore. What surprised me was the relief. Not because everything turned out well, it didn't exactly, but because the tension of maintaining something false had been heavier than I realized. Without it, there was space again. Fewer eyes, fewer assumptions. The story faded, slowly, unevenly, like most things do. I learned something uncomfortable from all of it. Not that people are eager to believe lies or that I'm uniquely susceptible to this kind of drift, just that narratives don't need intention to form. They only need silence at the right moment. I still think about that first hesitation, the split second where I chose ease over accuracy. It didn't feel like a decision at the time, but it was. And I understand now that correcting the record early isn't about integrity in some abstract sense. It's about preventing a future where the truth costs more than you're willing or able to pay.